most people going to take a guess that it may be even true in this group. But most people, no matter where I've given it to, I've given it to conservative, liberal, progressive groups. Most people come into the lecture with their minds already made up. They know the answer to the question. And they just want me to kind of give them historical information to confirm what they already know is the right answer, right? I try to offer, I was talking about this last night, I try to offer a little bit of a nuanced perspective to this. But what I got interested in this question, because I said last night, I often have students who are evangelical Christians, and they come into my American history classes with this knowledge or this idea that, we live in a Christian country and the founders wanted it that way. And there were so many people who would respond this way in history class, who come into office hours, and say, you said this, I'm not sure, that's not what I learned in, Sunday school or something like that. And I thought, well, if my students are wrestling with this, and it's a hot topic in the press all the time, usually you have two talking heads on television, neither of them really know much about American history, but they're usually arguing politically back and forth about whether America is a Christian nation. I thought, why don't I tackle this? This might be a good book. It's a relevant topic. Let me use my training as an 18th century historian to address this. And thus this book, this is the second edition of the book you see here. I just, on September 5th, I was at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, which is, some of you know, where the first Continental Congress was held. And they had a special symposium. They're doing all kinds of symposiums throughout the next couple of years as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, or 1776. But they had a special forum with clergy from the historic churches of Philadelphia, the current clergy who are the leaders of these historic churches, to talk about the image that you see here on the screen, which is Jacob Doucet, the Anglican minister who was asked to open the First Continental Congress in Prague. So it was a really interesting forum of these mostly mainline Protestant clergy who were talking about how they deal with sort of religion and public life and politics and so forth. But I got to give the 30-minute kind of little historical introduction to this prayer. And one of the things that I told them that day was one of the problems that we have in understanding what really happened when Jacob Doucet prayed at the First Continental Congress is this image. Because this image was created by a 19th century artist who was very interested in promoting America as a Christian nation. And thus you have, I think I described it earlier this month in Philly at Carpenter's Hall as a kind of almost looks like the Continental Congress is having a Pentecostal prayer meeting or something like that going on here. It probably would not look like that. But my goal with this book was to try to give as honest, and historians can never be objective. They always bring their biases to bear on the past. But the goal is to try to understand what happened. And my goal here was to try to understand the role of religion in the 18th century, the role of religion at the time of the American founding, in a way that was, at least I tried to keep contemporary partisan politics out of the mix, right? So this was my agenda. What did they believe about Christianity and the founding? The first thing I want to say is that the title of this book and of this talk, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, is really not a question that anyone was asking in the United States until probably the 1970s. Last night we were talking about the rise of the Christian right. I think much of the debate over this question, was America founded as a Christian nation, is really driven by people who are politicians, have a political view in the 20th century, and then superimposing that view upon the 18th century people who were not really asking that question. in any significant way, shape, or form, right? They were certainly interested in religion and how it would affect the republic, but they weren't asking, are we a Christian nation or aren't we a Christian nation? That wasn't a debate they were having. So in some ways, this is a really bad title. It's a sort of ahistorical title for a book. So I want to spend this first lecture sort of going over, sort of summarizing in 4 or 5 points, right? How we should think about this question when you're, someone confronts you with it, or you get into a debate with someone. What does the 18th century have to say about this? The first point that I want to make is Americans have always understood themselves or believed that they were living in a Christian nation. Again, that is a historical claim. That is not me saying they were right or wrong to believe that, or I'm not saying whether by believing that they were interpreting the Constitution or the founding correctly. I'm just saying Americans have always believed that they are living in a Christian nation. I made this assertion about maybe 7 or 8 years ago at the Toro Synagogue, where I was speaking in Rhode Island, the oldest still standing synagogue in the United States. And a Jewish scholar was there, and I was a little nervous when I said that Americans have always seen themselves living in a Christian nation. At the break, he turned over to me. He goes, "That's exactly right. As a Jew, I've always felt like I was living in a Christian nation, right? I mean, Americans have always perceived that way. But the question is, what did people mean when they said they were living in a Christian nation? There, things get a little interesting. So, you have someone like, for example, Martin Luther King Jr., who in his letter to a Birmingham jail, if you've read that, his famous letter when he was imprisoned in Birmingham during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, he talks about America needs to go back to its Judeo-Christian roots, he says. He quotes all of these saints like Augustine and Aquinas. He quotes Jefferson and so forth, and says, in order for America to be a truly Christian nation, we have to deal with these problems of segregation and racism so that we can become a more truly Christian nation. And he uses that Christian nation language throughout the entire thing. And much of his career, he believed that America was a Christian nation, but it had not fulfilled its identity yet as a Christian nation because it had not dealt with the great sin of racism. So again, go read Martin Luther King. You see this kind of Christian nation language all over his writings. This guy, Washington Gladden, maybe some of you have never heard of, but he was one of the founders of the so-called social gospel in the late 19th, early 20th century. Washington Gladden believed that the purpose of Christianity was to solve social ills, right? Help the poor, right? Bring social justice to the world. He got into a lot of fights with the fundamentalists that I was talking about last night, who believed that the fundamental purpose of Christianity was to get people saved and get them into heaven, right? Gladden was, again, one of the leaders, along with a man named Walter Rauschenbusch, of the social gospel movement. If you read Washington Gladden over and over again, he is invoking the idea of America as a Christian nation. We will become a Christian nation by serving the poor, by helping others in need, by sheltering the homeless, by advancing the causes of social justice in the name of the teachings of Jesus and in the name of Christianity. We will become a truly Christian nation. Again, this rhetoric of Christian nation is all over Washington Gladden and much of the social gospels. I talked about the next guy a little bit last night, Jerry Falwell, who believed, of course, and really constructed the modern Christian right narrative, helped to construct. I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. Of the idea that America, was founded as a Christian nation, and we need to reclaim it, we need to renew it, we need to restore it, right? And founded the moral majority in the 1970s. But again, often talked about America as a Christian nation. Pope Leo XIII, this is really interesting because Protestants were running around like Glavin and others from his era saying, we need America to be more Christian, and our founders, the way we're living right now, especially in relationship to the marginalized people in America, we are not acting Christianly towards them, right? And that's not how the founders, that's not applying liberty and freedom and all these things that were based on to all people, right? That's what the Protestants were saying. And let's go back, you often heard Protestants talking about, like, we weren't founded on secular principle, go back to the Mayflower, they would go back to the Puritans in New England. Look, it was religious Christian people who founded or settled first in this country. What's interesting about Pope Leo, he bought into that argument that, like, Mayflower, the origins, and he would say, well, you want to really talk about the origins of America as a Christian country, let's go back to St. Augustine, Florida, or the missions and Spanish missions in Texas or in California that predated any English settlements here. Catholics were here first, so America must be a Christian nation, although we're a Catholic Christian nation, not this Protestant nation that all the others are saying. Billy Graham in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and throughout the 70s, I mentioned him last night, believed that America would become a Christian nation if more and more people accept Jesus as Savior, become born again, right? His answer to Soviet communism, his answer to the moral degradation of society, as he liked to call it, as he put it, was to get people saved. And if more and more people got saved, America would become a Christian nation. The last person, Mercy Otis Warren, she was one of the first historians of the American Revolution. She wrote a book on the American Revolution in the early 19th century. And in that book, it's almost like a providential history. She talks about God blessing the United States, right? The American exceptionalism of 1776. God is behind us, right? And she is often invoked by women's rights and women's activists as being, the first, one of the first chroniclers of the American Revolution was a woman. They'll point to, right? Mercy Otis Warren. And then at the same time, she was also a very, very devout Christian who saw the hand of God in the founding of America, and thus, wrote in such a way that America was created as a uniquely Christian nation and was kind of on the side of God in those things. So my point here is to suggest that Christian nation rhetoric, right, is out there. You can find it in a variety of different places. You just have, and again, all of these people would talk about America as a Christian nation. You just need to figure out what they mean by it, right, when they refer to it. Now, in the next lecture, I want to talk a little bit more about Christian nationalism and try to suggest that there may be a difference between Christian nationalism as we think about it today and the idea that all of these people have, although maybe not all of them, but some of them believe, there's a difference between believing America, Christianity is important to America and to our moral climate, and this idea of Christian nationalism that we see in the press today. We'll come back to that later. So that's my first point. Americans have always believed that they were living in a Christian nation. If you did not believe that at some point in American history, if you did not believe we were living in a Christian nation, there were people who did. You were in the decided minority. Right? This was something that was believed by Jews, by Christians, Protestant, Catholic. That was the dominant theme throughout the United States history. Again, you were in the minority, if you did not. So how did this idea of, let's talk a little bit more about how this idea of America as a Christian nation played out in different historical circumstances. In some ways, the Civil War, I'll just use this as one example. The Civil War could really be understood of course, as a war over slavery, as a war, over the sovereignty of states versus nationalism, Union versus Confederacy. You could also really understand the Civil War as two competing visions of a Christian nation, right? So here's the guy on the left, Rufus Choate. He was the senator from Massachusetts in the late 1850s and 1860 when the Civil War started, 61. He believed that the United States was a Christian nation because at the time of the Constitution, God was present, and this was a pretty common view among politicians in the 19th century, right? God put this union together in 1787, 88, 89, during the Constitutional Convention, and this was a sacred union, he often referred to it as, a united, loving, and Christian America. And to break up that union, right, to divide this union that God clearly put together in their minds, was an act of sin. It was an act of opposition to what God has put together. So he often made, and again, he's representative of many northern congressmen. He made this argument that the United States is a Christian nation and it is a unified Christian nation since the time of the Constitution, and the Confederacy was breaking that up and thus challenging what God had created. Now, of course, there becomes a little bit, by the mid-1860s, you also see, of course, the abolitionist argument, or the argument that America is a Christian nation because they're opposed to the institution of slavery. But the first real, most powerful argument for union was the nationalist argument. Right? In other words, we are a unified nation, and the Confederate, created by God, and the Confederacy is breaking that up. We're now on a moral crusade to end slavery was also part of it. That didn't come until, the war had already begun. Now, of course, there were abolitionists who were already preaching this, right? But in terms of American policy towards the war, the North was much more interested in preserving the union, the God-created union, than they necessarily were in ending the institution of slavery. Abraham Lincoln famously said, again, I'm paraphrasing here, he would gladly allow slavery to exist alongside of free states if it preserved the union, right? The God-ordained union, right? The story of why he changed his mind is a whole other lecture. But nevertheless, the North believed they were a Christian nation. Then you had the South, who believed they were also, God was on their side, right? They were a Christian nation as well. Some of you who know the preamble to the United States Constitution will recognize some of these words in the Confederate Constitution. We the people, not in order to form a more perfect union, right? We the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a permanent and federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution. If you read I'll get to this in a second, but if you read the United States Constitution, and especially the preamble, but anywhere in the United States Constitution, there is no invocation of God anywhere, right? It's a largely secular document. Again, I'll get to this here in a second, because this is going to be my next point, right? But the Confederacy said, look, I was talking about this last night, but we have, slavery here, right? There's an order to society. God has created an ordered society. Slaves are at the bottom of that society. And to disrupt that society is to disrupt what God has put together. So when they write their Constitution, they say, again, it's written in South Carolina, they say, no, we are going to invoke God. We're going to say God is on our side. Well, unlike all those heathen Northerners up there who won't even put God in their Constitution, we have God in ours. We are the true Christian nation, right? Is their argument. based upon their interpretation of Scripture. We're following Scripture, right? Slavery is okay. What's really interesting is the North was so irritated by that argument the Confederate politicians and theologians were making about that we have God in our Constitution and you don't, that there was a movement right after the Civil War. It's called the National Reform Association. The NRA, not that NRA, but the NRA, that's the National Reform Association, had nothing to do with guns. They wanted to create a constitutional amendment, right, an additional amendment to the U.S. Constitution to add the fact that we are a Christian nation into the Constitution. And it did not pass, it failed. But it shows you just how much, Confederates have it in there. That's embarrassing that they have it in there and we don't. So let's create a constitutional amendment to put it in. Right? And there's a story about that. I unpack in the book a little bit. So one little kind of window into this, right? The Civil War illustrates that there is this clear battle between what is a Christian nation and what isn't, and both sides wanted to claim God on their side. Of course, Lincoln did his best to rise above us, with his second inaugural address, where he said both sides pray to the same God, both call upon his name, right? But the Almighty has his own purposes, Lincoln said, kind of rising above this clash between the two Christian nations, so to speak. So the second point I want to make, the Bible was important to the revolutionary generation. The Bible was important to the revolutionary generation. What do I mean by this? There was a study done in the 1980s, and several scholars have come along later and added to the study about how the founding fathers used the Bible. They defined founding fathers as anyone who signed this study, the scholarly study out of the University of Houston, defined the founding fathers as anyone who signed the Declaration of Independence, anyone who signed the Constitution, or anyone who signed one of the state constitutions that were created after America declared its independence, and the Articles of Confederation, which some of you remember was the government in between the Revolution and the Constitution. And what they found was that the Bible was cited by the founding fathers more than any other piece of literature. The founders cited the Bible more than any others, and that makes perfect sense. I mean, this was a very biblically literate society. New England at the time of the Revolution, because of the Puritan background the Puritans settled there, was the most literate society in the world. The literacy rates were well over 90% in Massachusetts, compared to, in the 18th century, probably somewhere around 20% to 25% in Europe. So, people were people of the book, right? They understood the Bible, even if they didn't believe it or they were skeptical of it, they understood it as literature. What's interesting about those statistics is this. The Bible was the most cited source, but it didn't have a majority of citations. In other words, I can't remember off the top of my head, something like 30% of all the sources came from the Bible. But if you added up all of the other sources, whether they be Enlightenment thinkers, whether they be classical thinkers like, Plato and stuff like that, or whether they be even contemporary political tracts from the 18th century, political thinkers like John Locke and others from that period, if you added all of those up, they far exceeded the Bible in terms of quotes. But in terms of just one book, it was clearly the Bible. And again, this has been confirmed now. This study has been confirmed by multiple scholars since then. So clearly the Bible was present. The Bible was important to the founders. What interested me, though, was how the Bible was used by the founding fathers, by the founding generation, and by the clergy of the day as well, who were on one side or the other of the revolutionary story. So let me illustrate that point here by talking about a verse from the Bible. Okay, Galatians 5:1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then and do not let yourselves be burdened by a yoke of slavery. So this was one of the top 3 verses that was cited by the revolutionary generation, of that amount of quotes in their writings. They quoted Galatians 5:1. More, I'll mention the other big one too here in a second, but they quoted Galatians 5:1 more than most other passages from the Bible, right? Now, so I got interested in this, and I started reading kind of commentaries, like historical commentaries on Galatians 5. So, I went all the way back to like the patristic period, right? The early church. I began reading, Origen and Clement of Alexandria, these things I got reading. And then I started reading the Reformation, right? I started reading Aquinas, Augustine, but then the Reformation, Calvin and Luther, all the ways that they interpreted this verse. And generally what I found was the interpretation of the verse went something like this, right? We are bound, or human beings are somehow bound by a yoke of sin or slavery, or slaves to sin nature, right? We're prone to, human nature is prone to do bad things, and we're held in bondage by that. But Jesus Christ, through his death and burial and resurrection, they said, has set us free from those things, right? Has lifted the yoke of slavery so that we can live a Christian life, would be the argument. Again, varies differently by each person, but that was the general theme, the general thrust, right? So I wanted to see, how the revolutionary generation, what kind of context were they using this verse? So after the book came out, I actually found this. It's not in the book, but there was a minister in New Jersey. His name was Enoch Green, and in 1766, I think, 1767, he preached a sermon on Galatians 5. And I was at the Rutgers University Archives reading his sermons. They had his actual manuscript sermons. And I found the sermon and I'm reading, this is interesting. And, it didn't really strike me at all because it was pretty much the same interpretation of the verse as all historically the Christian church had interpreted, the way I just described it, right? Christ has set us free from sin, or that kind of thing. So I kept flipping through the file, and then about an hour later, I was up to 1776 in his sermons. And I found another passage from Galatians, another sermon of Galatians 5:1, 10 years later. So immediately I thought, thinking like modern pastors maybe do. I'm not a pastor, but I know pastors, or ministers. I said, this is probably the same sermon, right? Isn't that what ministers do? They pull out the file. Where's the Galatians 5 sermon? They'll forget it 10 years later, right? I'll do this one again. And that's what I was fully expecting until I read the text. And this time, the entire interpretation of Galatians 5 had changed in 10 years. Yeah, this is April of 1776, or 75 it was, right around the time of Lexington and Concord, right? This time, it was for freedom that Christ has set us free, and this time the freedom was not like freedom in Christ or freedom in your faith. It was liberty. It was political freedom. Right? It was, the tyrannical, the yoke of slavery, he defined as those tyrannical British who were taking away our rights and our liberties, right? As good British subjects, right? And Christ, he actually had in the sermon manuscript. I wish I could have gotten this in the book. There's a third edition that's going to come out for the 250th anniversary, so I want to put this story in there. But he literally had in the document, Christ > Continental Army. So Christ has set us free. The Continental Army has set us free from it's given us freedom, or will give us freedom from the tyrannical British and it lifted us out of this yoke of slavery. Slavery was an important political term for the revolutionary, the patriots. They saw themselves, again, ironically, because when they looked out their backyards, many of them in the South at least, they saw actual enslaved people, right? But they saw themselves as being enslaved. They used that term all the time to describe their relationship with England. England is enslaving us, right? So they took that political idea and they began to apply it then to the scriptures, right? So again, this whole idea of using scripture to advance political ends, right, is not something that's new in American history. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the second lecture. The other most popular verse that's often on the top of the list is Romans 13. And the loyalists, those who opposed American independence, always quoted Romans 13. I'm going to read Romans 13. And I want you to do another exercise in empathy with me. Try to think about Romans 13 in the context of, say, the American Revolution in terms of 1776. And think about how someone who's against the American Revolution might find this verse useful. Okay, as I'm reading. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. Right? You can see how, if you believe in the inspiration and authority of the Bible, this could be a very powerful tool to show how, as one Anglican minister put it, the American Revolution was conceived in sin. Right? Because, I mean, if you keep reading in Romans 13, if you know that passage, you keep reading in Romans 13, it gets to the bottom. There's actually a part in there even about pay your tribute, pay your taxes. Right? I mean, how did that fly in the revolutionary generation? So the many Anglican clergy who were loyalists, they used scripture too to promote their political agenda, which was the revolution was bad, and it did not meet the standards of Romans 13. They were also quick to note, by the way, that when Paul wrote Romans 13, they would say he was being the church was being persecuted, right, by Nero. I think it was the emperor. Right? And even then, Paul says, this is what the Anglican clergy would say in the 18th century. And even then, this was Samuel Seabury, if you remember the Alexander Hamilton. You saw the Hamilton play, right? Samuel Seabury, right, made this argument all the time. Even then, even after being persecuted under Nero, we're still supposed to obey the authorities, according to Romans 13. Right? So, do with that what you will, but that's the 18th century way in which they were using scripture. So again, the Bible is often quoted. How was it quoted? Again, I'm not a biblical scholar. I've already sort of talked about that last night, right? I'm not a Bible scholar, so I can't tell you if like Enoch Green or any of these people were interpreting the Bible correctly when they quoted Galatians 5:1 or Romans 13. What I can tell you as a historian is that it was a very innovative way of interpreting the Bible that I had not seen before up until this point, right? So I'll just leave it at that, and you can make your own judgments about how politics shapes the way we read these patriots read the scriptures. Point 3, the United States Constitution is godless. When I do this talk in front of more Christian and conservative audiences, there's sometimes an audible gasp. Just kidding. Everything this up. But as I said before, there's nothing in the United States Constitution that says anything about God. There is a mention of religion in Article 6, and now I'm talking about even before the Bill of Rights. In Article 6, there is it is mentioned there that there will be no religious oath, test oath for office. In other words, anybody can hold federal office. Doesn't matter what you're, there'll be no religious test for holding office. And then, of course, after the Constitution is ratified, the Bill of Rights comes in. And of course, then you have the First Amendment. Still no mention of God, but you do have the Establishment Clause, which said there will be no state official religion. And then you have the Free Exercise Clause, which allows people to worship freely, or the Supreme Court has interpreted that as or not worship freely. So the Constitution it's really, really hard to make a case for America being a Christian nation based upon the reading of the United States Constitution. Now, having said that, and now the audible gasp comes from people, kind of secular people or people on the left, right? We're not talking about this. Having said that, there were many states, most states, I should say, who clearly wanted to have both test oaths and religious establishments in their states. The Constitution, in the 10th Amendment, I should say, to the Bill of Rights, it says, if you, at the time, 18th century, right? Anything that's not addressed in the Constitution of the United States will be decided by the states. Now, of course, this is the argument the Confederacy made during the Civil War, right? They said, well, the Constitution doesn't condemn slavery, right? It's back there, it treats slaves as 3/5 of a human being, right? So there's nothing that condemns it. So we can have slavery, and that's fine, right? But in terms of religion, so here's the state constitution of Pennsylvania where I live, right? In order to vote or to hold office in the state of Pennsylvania, you had to affirm this oath, right? I do believe in one God, the creator and the governor of the universe. So technically, right, I do believe in one God. So technically, like Unitarian, you didn't have to be Trinitarian, you could be Unitarian to vote, right? But you also have to believe that this God is the creator and governor of the universe. The reward, a deist believed in the 18th century would have believed that, right? The creator God. The rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked, no problem there. There would have been a lot of people who didn't necessarily believe in the resurrection or the divine inspiration of the Bible, who would believe that God would one day punish the wicked and good. And I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. So you had to believe in both the inspiration of the Old and New Testaments in order to vote or run for office in the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution. It's very similar. I always bring up the one about Vermont. Vermont's 1777 Constitution says the same thing, and it's always interesting because Vermont today is, probably one of the most progressive states in the country. First state to allow same-sex unions, same-sex marriage, so forth. But nevertheless, theirs actually adds one more thing. You have to observe the Christian Sabbath as well to be able to vote and hold office. The ones that don't embrace these ideas is Virginia and Rhode Island to some extent. But Virginia is the key, because there in Virginia, thanks to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, you have, and all of those on-the-ground evangelicals who voted for them that I was talking about last night, because they wanted complete religious freedom as well. They didn't want any test oaths or religious establishments because they had been persecuted under those, so they all voted for Jefferson. Thanks to those evangelicals, Jefferson and Madison, you have complete religious freedom in Virginia. Right, total religious freedom. There's no other colony like Virginia. Rhode Island comes very, very, very close to that. So this gets this back to this complexity idea. This kind of complicates the question, right? What was the nation in the 18th century? Was it a conglomeration of states, all with their own views of church and state, like Pennsylvania and Vermont and Virginia? Or was it, something unified under the United States Constitution? So, for example, you have states like Connecticut and Massachusetts, which has religious establishments. You understand what I mean by a religious establishment? It not only means that there is a state church that's the official church, the Congregational Church in Massachusetts and Connecticut, but your tax money goes to pay for the clergy and the upkeep of buildings and so forth for the Congregational Church, because they're the state church, even if you're not a member of the Congregational Church. That's what state church means, right? Massachusetts is the state church of Massachusetts is the Congregational Church until 1831. This is almost 50 years, right, after the United States Constitution is passed, because the states have the right to do this. Now, again, maybe in the Q&A, you can ask me, why is it like that today? Or is it still like that today? Does the Christian right have a legitimate argument when they appeal to these kinds of state constitutions? I'm happy to answer that question. But again, I told you, this is a history lecture. So if I start to answer those questions down the road, I'm getting out of the 18th century a little bit, right? But there are good answers to respond to those kinds of questions. It's just a matter of change over time. One of the things historians often just think about is change over time. Point 4. The founders were champions of religious freedom. Now, this gets complicated after what I just said, because the founders, to a man, believed that all Americans could worship God freely according to the dictates of their conscience. George Washington went out of his way, when he became first president, to write letters to virtually every religious group in America, telling them that they have the right to worship as they see fit, and government will never get in their way. He even goes as far as writing a letter to today we might even call them like a cult. This group known as the Swedenborgians, this tiny little sect. He actually took the time to write a letter to them and said, I am totally, have your back. You have the right to worship, freely in any way that you want. So you have Madison and Jefferson, of course, putting this into perhaps one of the greatest statements, I would argue the greatest statement of religious liberty ever written, the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty in 1786. This comes out of that Virginia story, that context I was just talking about. I mentioned the Toro Synagogue. You get to look at it now. Again, this is not the old. It's the oldest Jewish congregation in terms of the building. There were actually earlier Jewish congregations in New York that predated this, but they dissipated. They're no longer around. So here you have an interesting paradox, or an interesting another nuance here, right? In Pennsylvania, you could worship God any way you wanted, or you were free not to worship God without government interference. Right? The government can never tell you how to worship God. But if you couldn't uphold the divine inspiration of the Old and New Testament, you couldn't vote, you couldn't participate in government, right? But you were certainly free to worship it the way you wanted, was the argument. Right. So again, this is the 18th century world that I'm trying to bring you into. I like to tell my students the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Maybe we like some things they did, and maybe we didn't. But we want to try to listen to try to at least understand history. We have to see it in all its fullness and its complexity. And again, this is my point about why I try to look at this objectively, right? If I, without kind of giving you my personal views on things, if I was a progressive, I might, want to tell a story about the founding that did not include Pennsylvania's constitution in it, or maybe I cherry pick certain things out. Or if I was on the Christian right, I might sort of ignore the fact that the Constitution was godless, right? That wouldn't be really useful for my narrative if you're using the past to cherry pick to advance some kind of political or cultural agenda, which is fine to do, but oftentimes it's done very, very poorly, because most people, when they go into the past, they're looking for what I'm going to talk about in the next lecture, a usable past. Right? They're not interested in looking, it's like law office history, right? A lawyer goes into the past to look at past cases for the sole purpose of getting their client declared, in a murder trial, declared innocent. They're not interested in all the fullness and complexity. My vocation, my calling in life is to invite you into the complexity and then to question the way in which both sides on this issue, but mostly more the Christian right, I think, than the secular left, cherry-pick from the past to do this, right? So the past is messy, right? And historians come along, I think, and make those smooth places, whether the smooth place is a progressive position on the left or a conservative position on the right, make those smooth places a little rougher than they were before you encountered past. And most people don't like that. They get mad at me for that. People on both sides. Maybe some of you are getting mad at me right now. Final, last point. The founders believed that religion was good for the republic. Again, this is a historical statement, right? You can agree or disagree with it, but the founders believed that religion was good for the republic. Now here, I think a lot of people missed what the founders were trying to do when they said religion was good for the republic. And here's what I mean by that. Remember, the founding, I mean, if you listen to some people that I'm going to talk about in the next lecture, they make it sound like, George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, if he came to this mega church somewhere, down the road, they would be such, they'd be born again Christians who would be picked to be like on the elder board or something, right? Most of these founders would not have felt very comfortable in a kind of evangelical church today that champions them as being great Christian founders, right? But they did think, so my point here is that they were statesmen, these men. They were theologians, they weren't ministers. The people in the Second Continental Congress, the people in the Constitutional Convention, they were building a nation, they were building a republic. And they were educated men, so they had read, either self-educated or formally educated, but they had read, they knew what a republic was. They had read about the Roman Republic, and they had read about republics in the past. They knew why republics failed. They knew why republics succeeded, right? So they were employing their sort of educated knowledge to try to create this republic. And one of the things they knew was that in order for a republic to survive, and they learned this lesson from history, it required a certain degree of virtue, they would have called it. Now, when we hear the word virtue, we often associate it with some kind of Victorian morality in a Victorian novel or something, right? It's usually a feminine idea, right? The virtue of the woman, in the Victorian age and so forth, right? They're good morals, upstanding, right? Kind of thing. But in the 18th century, the word virtue was not as much a moral term as it was a political term. Someone who was virtuous was someone who was willing to sacrifice their self-interests at times, right? Because if you always had to sacrifice your self-interest, you'd have some form of tyranny, right? You'd have, whatever, you wouldn't have rights. But you would sacrifice your self-interest when it was important or at times for the greater good of the community, for the greater good of the republic. You laid that aside. That was a virtuous man. And I say man because it was a very masculine idea. Because men were out there in public life, right? They were the ones who were supposed to be the sacrifice. Women had a role too. They were supposed to raise good Republican virtuous sons who would do this, right? That was their role. They were often referred to by historians as Republican mothers, right? Who would raise good Republican men for the success of the nation. Well, the founders believed that religion, and they couldn't ignore it, right? It was all around them, Christianity specifically. If Christians knew they believed or thought that Christians believed and would act upon this, that they would sacrifice, they knew how to sacrifice their self-interests for something greater than themselves, was the thesis, the theory. God, right? Or the faith. Right? They were willing to lay themselves down, or at least that's what the scriptures, right? Greater love hath no man than this, right? That to lay down his life for his friends. If religion could serve those virtuous ends, virtue as I just defined it, right? Serve the common good in some way, then the founders were all for it. right? I mean, they said, let's let 1,000 religions bloom if religion is going to teach people to be selfless members of a Republican society. So again, they believed religion was important to the degree that it produced virtuous citizens. Now, I'm firmly convinced, I have no evidence to prove this, but I think I can make a logical assumption of this. I'm firmly convinced that there was some kind of religious faith that was kind of, we were talking about this at lunch today with some people, was prophetic in nature. Some kind of religious faith where it was not, it was not just people serving the greater good of the nation, but rather speaking prophetically about the ills of the nation or the sins of the nation or whatever those might be, slavery or whatever. I really don't think the founding fathers, from what I read, as I read them, would have any use for that kind of religion, because that religion was not meant to build up and create virtuous people in a republic. So, my college where I teach I said this last night, comes out of the Anabaptist Mennonite Brethren tradition. We don't fly a flag on campus because that tradition believes that the kingdom of God is above the nation. So, you're not going to find a flag, although you will find, we're compromisers. You will find one in the gym because it's NCAA regulations. But a true Mennonite school, like Eastern Mennonite in Virginia or Goshen in Indiana, would just say, we're out of the NCAA. We're not going to fly a flag. Right? But if there were kind of German Mennonites in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who were saying, calling out the founders for their sins of some type or the nation for doing wrong, I don't think that, they would of course allow them to worship freely, but I don't think they would think they were very helpful for the republic, is the point I'm making there. So I will stop there, but hopefully this will give you some kind of historical, touch points. If you really want to dig into this, get the book. But this will give you some historical touch points to show that, about the complicated nature of the 18th century. In the next lecture, stay tuned, you guys out there on Zoom. Stay tuned, because in the next lecture now, I want to show the ways in which the Christian right has manipulated the history that I just laid out in order to advance the political agenda that they want to advance, and we'll talk more about this whole concept of Christian nationalism. So we'll take a break, and I'll turn the lectern over to Sarah.
So thank you. I can't wait to hear the second part of the lecture. So we will take about 10 minutes. So that means we'll come back at 3:10. We'll have some refreshments in the back for those of you who are here in person, and for those of you on Zoom, I don't know what's in your refrigerator, but you can go find out, and we'll reconvene at 3:10. Thank you.
Many in the camp of what we might call Christian nationalists today think about this history that I just gave you in the previous lecture. Now, again, I've looked at your list of speakers on Zoom the last several speakers. I know Christian nationalism has been a topic that you've addressed in the past. I want to try to address it, maybe a little bit differently. I don't know. I didn't hear those talks, but I noticed none of them were historians who addressed this. So, we'll come at you're getting the kind of historical background and then seeing how what I want to talk about today is how then Christian nationalism kind of rises out of this understanding of the American past, which I think is it's not that Christian nationalists can find stuff in American history and the American founding that they can use to advance the idea that somehow that Christianity was important to the American founding. They can cherry pick things whatever they want. What they're not interested in is the complexity of the past and the way I just laid it out, right? They pick, and that's what I mean again by a usable past, right? Everyone's going into the past and finding something that they need there. And I think Christian nationalists do this as well. I am convinced that if you want to pose a challenge to Christian nationalism today, any kind of challenge must begin not with kind of preaching against it or not with, pointing out, well, Jesus really said this or whatever, but it begins with history. because the entire Christian nationalist premise is based upon a historical view of the founding. Without that historical view of the founding, you don't have many legs to stand upon to make your case that we need to get back to or reclaim what the founders believed about society, right? So I think historians, as kind of you often hear, well, that was the most boring class I ever took in high school. I hate history, right? But there's something at stake in trying to understand the 18th century, especially in our current day and age, when you have political programs and political policy decisions and politics generally being driven by a half-baked or perhaps just sometimes flat out wrong understanding of the founding, right? So, this is the kind of thing that, historians, by just doing good history, can feel good about, right? It gets people like me up and right, to be able to say, like, we're doing good work. I'm not just, like, torturing students with dates and names, all day. We're trying to construct an understanding of American identity, a historical understanding that has some bearing on how the present is unfolding right now. So that's what I want to discuss today. And again, much of this lecture will be on Christian nationalism, but I will be talking constantly about the way Christian nationalists invoke the past as they're doing it, right? So think about this kind of as a history of the idea of Christian nationalism, what's going on today and how we got kind of to this point. We all have seen the images, right, at on January 6th at the Capitol of the protesters, wielding crosses. Or, here's the famous QAnon, or infamous QAnon shaman, right? Thank you, this prayer. Thank you, divine, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent creator God, for this is when he was standing behind the speaker's bench, right? For filling this chamber with your white light and love, with your white light and harmony. Thank you for filling this chamber with patriots that love you and that love Christ. Right, I mean, again, this God and country kind of thing. Yeah, just a few pictures here to start us off. Maybe you've seen the Jesus with the Make America Great Again hat on, which was paraded around January 6th. But a lot of this idea that America was founded as a Christian nation is also preached every Sunday, or some Sundays, especially on July 4th and on holidays. In big evangelical churches with evangelical pastors that have huge platforms. I was talking about some of these people last night. Have you ever heard of this guy, Robert Jeffress? Does he ring a bell? He is the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas. It is a historic Southern Baptist church. Every July 4th, he preaches a sermon called America is a Christian Nation, right? It's not even a question, right? America is a Christian nation. And, he makes a historical claim that America was founded as a Christian nation. And then back to our through lines that we were talking about last night, he then draws a through line straight from, the Christian founding, as he puts it, to, present American politics. Robert Jeffress was one of those so-called court evangelicals that I talked about last night. People who were made, supporter of Donald Trump, made appearances regularly at the White House for photo ops and so forth. There's a great book by a journalist from the Atlantic named Tim Alberta. I'm blanking on the title, but Tim Alberta interviewed Robert Jeffress. And in the book, he describes that Jeffress has, this kind of dark mahogany wood kind of office, and then in the corner is, Alberta describes it as a shrine to Donald Trump. And what he means by that is he has this whole table and this whole corner of his office devoted to him and Trump with pictures and Make America Great and stuff. This is in the office of the pastor of the First Baptist Church, Robert Jeffress. And he has a television ministry. If you're up late at night flipping the channels, you might see him on a cable channel preaching these kinds of sermons. There's a book that is getting a lot of traction within kind of Christian nationalist circles by a political scientist. He actually has a PhD in political science from LSU, Stephen Wolfe, who essentially is making the case in this book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, that the United States should be understood as an ethnic identity. Right? In other words, the United States is white Anglo nation, and it always has been that way, is his argument. And it takes some real fancy footwork with the past to be able to pull this off. But in other words, anyone else who's not white, who comes to this country is accepted here and welcome, but they should always understand that they are not the dominant ethnic group in the country. This book you may have never heard about, but if you go into this kind of evangelical, conservative evangelical MAGA, I would even say, media infrastructure, I was talking about these YouTube videos and so forth. This guy has carries a lot of cachet with this book on Christian nationalism. He believes the government should be run by a Christian prince, as he calls it. We should do away with democracy, and we should appoint a Christian. What he means by that is a sort of Christian right kind of leader who will advance laws and so forth to make America more Christian. I mean, it's if it's not a call for a theocracy, it's very, very close to one. I don't know much about the LSU political science department, but I can't imagine that his professors are happy with it. And then, of course, this kind of stuff translates into the political sphere. You have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who often appears on some of these Christian right programs to talk about, her Christianity and love for Jesus. But she was actually the first one to come out and say, if Christian nationalism means that America is founded as a Christian nation and that Christianity should be privileged in the United States over everything else, over other religions and just about everything else, then I'm a Christian nationalist, right? I welcome the term, right? And, we Christian nationalists are going to, be in the face of the secular left, if you want to call it that, or even the Christian left in that sense. We are the left's biggest fear. So again, this is everywhere. So what I want to do then with you a little bit is try to figure out what these Christian nationalists believe, and in the process, I want to also suggest maybe what they don't believe, because there's a media narrative out there which especially coming from the left, which paints people who are Christian nationalists who probably would not fall under that category. So let's talk a little bit about this. Some important definitional concerns. Again, here's the nuance piece of this, right? Not all people who believe that rights come from God or from Judeo-Christian ideals are Christian nationalists, right? You could believe, like Thomas Jefferson did in the Declaration of Independence, that God created us with rights, with natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and so forth, right? Whatever that God is, we can have a whole discussion, and I talk about this in the Christian America book, what Jefferson meant by God in the Declaration of Independence. But, you could believe that and not believe that, Christians should take over the country and have political power, right? You could believe in a kind of pluralism, right? In which, people of faith and people not of faith should live together, in some kind of democratic experiment, right? Secondly, not all Christians who voted for Donald Trump are Christian nationalists. And this gets to the point that I made last night. There's a lot of people who kind of held their nose in voting for Donald Trump, who do not want to create a theocracy, privileged Christianity, say that we need to get back to the founding, whatever that is, right? But there is a kind of painting with a broad brush that goes on in some sectors that anyone who voted for Donald Trump is a Christian nationalist. The data just doesn't support that. Not all people who take conservative positions on social issues, such as abortion and marriage, are Christian nationalists. right? Now, again, one might say, well, if you want to take away women's right to choose based upon your religious faith, then that's Christian nationalism, right? I think there are some people who say, well, we want to hold up traditional kind of values in a society, but we don't want to force those values upon other people, right? We want to still live in a pluralistic society. Not all people who want to bring their faith to bear on public and political life are Christian nationalists. This is a really kind of wide, general point here, because there are many people who want to bring Christian faith. We talked about Barack Obama, for example, last night. There are many people on the left, who want to bring their Christian faith to bear on issues of justice and political issues that, certainly are not Christian nationalists. Not all conservative evangelicals are Christian nationalists. I'm thinking about, say, off the top of my head, I don't know if anyone reads the New York Times, but, there are actually a couple of evangelical Christians who are regular op-ed columnists for the New York Times who have completely, David French being one who has completely rejected this kind of MAGA Christian national kind of idea, but yet is very, very conservative, right, and is an evangelical. And then I think probably one of the most important points here is that civil religion and Christian nationalism are not the same. I'm working on an essay on this for a book that's coming out soon, which makes this basic argument. Civil religion and Christian nationalism are not the same, although both do draw from Judeo-Christian values and language. So, civil religion, right, is often defined as the kind of vague God language that we use, right? One nation under God. Right, or there's Bible verses in the Capitol building, right? Or we make these appeals to a creator of some point. In some ways, what Jefferson was doing in the opening of the Declaration of Independence, right? The Creator God, these kinds of God bless America, right? A lot of these sort of gestures of what we call civil religion do not have a whole lot of sort of theological depth to them when they're used. It's just a kind of acknowledgement that there is a God, and somehow he is been around, or is somehow not affecting, but has been present since the founding, and we acknowledge him. Christian nationalism is something very, very different, because Christian nationalism does have kind of intellectual and ideological depth to it, in that it's an agenda, right? It's not a sort of vague reference to God bless America. There's a clear agenda here, a political agenda to try to capture the nation, and we'll talk more about this here in a second. So I do think they're two different things. Again, my school's tradition, Messiah's tradition, actually rejects both. They don't like civil religion or Christian nationalism because, they don't like God being referenced by politicians, even in a vague way, because that takes away from, that takes away from the true God, right? They would say. And then on the other hand, there are all kinds of examples of places where people on the left, separation of church and state, people won't like civil religion either. But civil religion, whatever you think about that, civil religion and Christian nationalism, I think, are two very, very different things. Civil religion is not as kind of aggressively political. It's much more cultural. Okay, so what do Christian nationalists believe? This one, we've spent some time with already today, but of course they believe that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. They are not interested in the complexity of the founding, as I laid out in the last lecture. They believe that the United States was a Christian nation. Some of them believed that the founding fathers were actually not just Christians, but kind of evangelical Christians who were trying to build a Christian nation. And a lot of that comes from what I call these kinds of pseudo-experts that the Christian right likes to trudge out. Has anyone ever heard of the Bartons, David Barton? You have people like David Barton and Tim Barton, huge followings. These guys have the ears of many congressmen and senators. They teach them, they get their American history from David Barton. He, again, runs this nonprofit called Wall Builders. He writes books. He goes around the country speaking. His son has recently taken over, Tim, but David's still around. I've talked about David Barton. I've written about David Barton. He is probably the most significant player in the whole Christian nationalist movement that no one knows about, because he's behind the scenes feeding historical information, usually bad historical information, to people in power. And people in power turn to him when they're looking for some way to make a historical argument about whatever political position they want to make. I've actually was asked recently to debate David Barton, and he didn't want to do it. And part of, I was happy to do it, but part of me didn't want to do it either. And here's why. Because David Barton and I see the past and history in such fundamentally different ways. David Barton has this collection of primary source documents. In other words, he has purchased, I don't think, it's his donors who helped him purchase these, letters from John Adams, for example, where John Adams says, Christianity is an important part of the Republic, completely taken out of context, but John Adams said these things. This is what I noticed, that you can find whatever you want to find in the past. Or he'll have a copy of George Washington's farewell address, where he says religion is the pillar of the Republic. And he'll hold these things up in lectures, right? And everyone is kind of wowed at the fact that, he's holding the document. Now, I'll immediately, I would immediately say, yeah, he'd probably try to do that in the debate. And I'd say, yeah, of course the document says that. Let's put it out. Let's talk more about, how to think historically about that document, right? What's the context? What quote are you pulling out? What else did John Adams say, right? Let's talk about the larger, way in which you're interpreting the document. Let's talk about the way you're using the past to speak to the present in irresponsible ways, right? But his idea, it's almost like a kind of originalist view of the Constitution, right? You go back, you find a quote, and then you say, you jump 200 and some odd years to the present, and you say, there we go, right? That's not how historians work. You notice I've been using a lot of C words, context, change over time, right? All of these things are what the historian brings to the conversation. We think in complexities, right? Another C, right? We think about choices. Last night I was talking about contingency, right? All of these things. This is my book, Why Study History, these 5 C's of historical thinking, which I use, it's an undergraduate textbook. So I don't know what I would do in a debate with Barton. He would hold up a document and everyone would go, wow. I would probably say to him, yeah, I can read that document. There's 100 different places online. I could read it too. What's the point of you're holding the document? That's cool, right? But it says the same thing when I Google it, right? I can still interpret it that way. So I don't know how productive it would be. Again, this was going to be, I was invited to do this in Madison, Wisconsin sometime next year, and I don't think it's going to happen simply because, for the reasons I just mentioned. But yeah, even if you Google David Barton and my name, you'll find him kind of disparaging me, left and right on his website. Yeah, never met him. One of the productions of the Wall Builders is the Founders Bible over here, right? They basically took the Bible and they showed all the places where the Bible verses, teach patriotism and liberty, American liberty. And I think this has sold really, really well from what I understand this Founders Bible. Over here, I just had to throw this in. This is recent. The Lee Greenwood, God Bless the USA Bible that Trump was selling, right? Totally comes out of this whole kind of, someone got in Trump's ear. I don't know who, but said, you do a God Bless the USA Bible and merge patriotism, and it's similar to this one. It's got quotes from the founding fathers and so forth. You know, you will not only probably make a lot of money, right, but you will also maybe win some votes, right, from these kinds of Christian nationalists. And so here he is speaking. Number two point I want to make was America was founded as a Christian nation, and as a result, Christian nationalism fuses the Bible with patriotism. Now, last lecture I gave you an 18th century example of the way in which politics kind of affected or shaped biblical interpretation, right? I gave you two, Galatians 5 and Romans 13. Of course, it was only in the 18th century that they did this kind of thing, right? Wrong. Here's Mike Pence, right, at the 2020 GOP convention. 2 Corinthians 3:17. Now the Spirit of the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, right? Again, this means freedom for, people to, political freedom, right? Liberty, freedom, political stuff, rather than, the way in which historically the idea of freedom has always been understood within the Christian tradition. But it gets even more interesting, let's put it that way. One of the favorite verses, you probably heard this from people who are Christian nationalists, is 2 Chronicles 7:14, this Old Testament passage, right? If my people who are called by my name humble themselves, pray, seek my face, and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land, right? If we can just get the right people in office who will pray and bow down before God, everything will be fine. God will bless us. In some ways, this gets into the whole idea, we'll talk about this again in a second, of America, the idea of America as a new Israel, right? That America is somehow in a covenant with God. And that if America does well and is moral and is pleasing to God, God will bless them. If America, is going down the path of moral degradation, then God will remove his blessing, right? Curse them. But then here's the Christian nationalist view. Again, Mike Pence was a master at it. He still is. But he was a master at this kind of fusing the Bible and sort of Christian nationalist Republican politics, right? Pray with faith. This is at the National Day of Prayer. Pray with faith in those ancient words, that if those people who are called by his name will humble themselves and pray, then he'll hear from heaven and he'll heal our land. This one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This fusion of 2 Chronicles 7:14 and the Pledge of Allegiance somehow, right? Kind of come together in one piece of rhetoric here for former Vice President Pence. Or my favorite one is Hebrews 12, right? The great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race before us, looking to Jesus, right? The pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God, right? Here's Pence at the GOP convention. I remember he gave this speech. It was during COVID, so there wasn't a convention. He gave this speech at Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor, right? So let's run the race marked out for us. Let's fix our eyes. I'm surprised you didn't add another sentence there, like George Washington, and suddenly all the heroes of the faith in the book of Hebrews 12, right? Abraham, all that suddenly are now the founders, right? Let's fix our eyes on the land of heroes and let their courage inspire us. And let's fix our eyes on the author and perfecter of our faith and freedom, and never forget that where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, right? So there's a kind of mashup of the Corinthians verse, Hebrews 12, right? But this language is constantly used by Christian nationalists, this kind of fusing of scripture and patriotic kind of sentiments, right? And people who like Pence and Trump and Christian nationalists, they eat this stuff up, right? So many of them know what they're doing, right? Know what they're doing when they fuse the scriptures like this. 3, this gets to my point more about Israel. Christian nationalists believe that America is God's chosen nation. They rely upon a faulty view of American exceptionalism. And, how many of you remember Ronald Reagan? Remember, he always used to refer to the United States as a city on a hill, right? He would use the term shining city on a hill. And he would appeal to this sermon that was preached in 1630 by the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, who preached a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity, in which he called the new settlement in Massachusetts Bay a city upon a hill. Somehow Ronald Reagan slipped the word shining in there. That was not in the original sermon, but Reagan did a lot of things like that. But this idea that America is exceptional, America is a light to the world. Now again, Winthrop meant it in terms of Puritanism and Calvinism, and the spirituality of the Puritans should be a light to the world. But eventually this became kind of fused into this idea into democracy, right? America is a light to the world because we're a democracy, we're shining the light of democracy. I don't have time to go into this, but there's been some fascinating new research on that sermon that Winthrop preached. Of course, it's drawn from the Sermon on the Mount, right, in Matthew chapter 5. But there's some research that sermon probably wasn't even about, some kind of exceptionalism for Massachusetts Bay. The sermon probably wasn't even about Matthew 5. The text of the sermon, which was cut off, we don't know what it was, but it's clear from the sermon that the sermon was actually another passage out of Galatians 5 that talked about loving one another and living together in community with one another in kind of a neighbor love. And if we don't live this way, if we don't love each other and care for our neighbors, we will not survive as a society, right? But for many Christian nationalists, they take that sermon, and again, it's filtered through Reagan, right? Actually, John Kennedy was the first one to refer to a city on a hill. America as a city on a hill. But it was filtered through Reagan, who really made it. Go YouTube Reagan, go home, YouTube Reagan's farewell message to the country, right? He's constantly, we're a great shining city on a hill, he would say. And you see it all the time in not Democratic and Joe Biden has used it, right? Not Democrat and Republicans use it. But it's this idea that America is somehow unique, exceptional, not because they're a democracy, but because God is blessing them in a way that he's not blessing other countries, right? America is the unique nation, the new Israel. Now, what's really interesting about this is not only do they believe that America is kind of a new God's special chosen people, but they've never abandoned also the Old Testament idea that Israel is God still has a place for Israel in kind of his larger plan for human history. So the goal is to preserve Israel. I think there's 3 reasons why you hear Christian nationalists so interested in Israel. The first one comes from a theological view known as dispensationalism, which believes that the second coming of Christ is not going to happen until Israel returns to the land. So 1948 is a huge date for these dispensationalists because Israel becomes a nation. But ultimately, you have to protect the land of Israel, right? The original land, Judah and Samaria, they refer to it as, right? From any kind of, in this case, Islamic or Palestinian attempts to carve out space for them, right? Because the land, God promised the land to Israel, and we need to get all of that land back. And until that happens, Jesus Christ is not going to return to the Temple Mount on Jerusalem, according to the Book of Revelation, right? So we need to defend Israel, right? And America is serving God by defending the right of Israel to exist and defending them against all oncomers, because they're serving God by helping to preserve this eschatological end times kind of plan, right? That's one reason. The second reason is, even if you reject this kind of end times plan, you still believe that, God cares about Israel from the Old Testament, right? Those who bless Israel, I will bless. Those who curse Israel, I will curse, is the idea. So even if you don't believe that, like, Jesus is coming to the temple on the mount and we need to get all the Israelites together, there's still people, Christian nationalists, who say, well, Old Testament, God still cares about Israel, and so should we. Kind of a more general view. But, and then the third view is a little more benign, which is largely the position taken by, the Biden administration right now and by Democrat and Republican presidents. But Christian nationalists will make this argument when they have to. They don't want to be perceived as being overly religious. So they'll say, of course, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, right? All the Islamic countries are theocracies of some type. So we must protect democracy. But nevertheless, America is God's chosen nation for such a time as this. They often quote the book of Esther, right? To protect Israel, right? And thus protect some kind of end times plan for the world. And then four, of course, Christian nationalism, I would say just generally the Christian right as a political is not a religion. I mean, I guess it's a religion by some definitions, but it's a political movement, right? The idea is to gain power and to exercise political power, Christianity, as they define it, over everybody else, and to transform society alongside of, to transform to Christian beliefs. So you see this all over the place. Does this term ring a bell? Seven Mountain Dominionism. This is an incredibly popular view among many charismatics and Pentecostals who support Donald Trump. And they draw from Isaiah 2:2, there shall come to pass in the later days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains. And, they've said these mountains in our culture today are education, religion, family, business, government, military, arts, entertainment, and media. And the goal is for Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, to gain control of all seven of these mountains. And when Christians have control over these mountains, these cultural mountains, it will precipitate the return of Jesus Christ, right? Because finally the millennium will be here in that sense, right? God will now rule over all things, and these Christian nationalists will help. This is that guy I was talking about last night, Lance Wall. Now, here's his Cyrus coin. The guy who was here last night who said the $100 coin. Actually, I saw this on the news this morning. Trump is now selling a $100 gold coin, but it doesn't have King Cyrus on it. This one's the one with Trump on one side, King Cyrus on the other. I hate to use the word intellectual here, but it is a kind of movement of ideas. Lance Wallnau is the ideological or intellectual mastermind, if you will, behind Seven Mountain Dominionism. This is the guy who was featured on 60 Minutes I was talking about last night. This has now become so mainstream that 60 Minutes is doing stories on these Seven Mountain Dominions. Go find it on YouTube. Wallnau actually tells 60 Minutes what Seven Mountain Dominionism is and what he plans to do. Right? They're not even trying to hide it anymore. Right? But Wallnau is one. POTUS Shield movement. This was a Pentecostal charismatic movement with millions of followers that said they would create a prayer shield over the White House. To pray for the president. Of course, Donald Trump, the POTUS Shield movement quickly ended when Biden took office, right? There was no need to pray anymore to create a prayer shield. But again, huge followings, and they're all sort of MAGA, pro-Trump people. Anyone know who this guy is? His name is Rafael Cruz. He's the father of Ted Cruz, the senator from Texas. He is one of the leaders of the POTUS Shield charismatic MAGA movement. He is a charismatic Pentecostal minister. His son, Ted Cruz, was raised in that culture. So it's hard to separate Ted Cruz's political agenda from, his Christian agenda. I actually wrote a piece back in 2016 for Christianity Today magazine. They asked me to say, what is going on with Ted Cruz? This is when he was running for president. And I made that argument in this piece that, Ted Cruz is a dominionist. Right, he was raised as a dominionist, and he knows all of these people. He knows Lance Wallnau. He speaks there. He speaks at these pro-Israel events. Right, he's very well known. And in fact, one of the really underreported stories of the 2016 election was how many of those Pentecostals and charismatics turned away from Ted Cruz towards Trump, which was kind of a little bit of a shocking kind of move for a lot of us who kind of followed this. And studied this from far. I mentioned Paula White last time. She is a prosperity gospel preacher and a Seven Mountain Dominionist who is, Trump says, she claims to be, and Trump doesn't disagree, Trump's spiritual advisor. She's the one I mentioned last night who led Trump to the Lord, so to speak. This guy right here is a man named Andrew Womack, another Seven Mountain Dominionist who has a huge following in Colorado Springs. You all know Lauren Boebert. Does she look familiar to you? She's a Colorado congressman who often speaks at Womack's events. This guy's fascinating. This guy went to Andrew Womack's Bible college. Again, I'm blanking on his actual name. I should notice because I've actually written it down. But he went to Andrew Womack's sort of Seven Mountain Dominionist Bible college. By the way, he's in that Bible college. There's a school. There is the David Barton School of Politics. That's one of the schools in the Andrew Womack Bible. Right? So he's a graduate of the David Barton School of Politics at Charis Bible Institute, CHARIS, outside of Colorado Springs. This is a picture, a selfie that he took in the Capitol on January 6th. Later that month, he was going to start as a youth pastor at a conservative evangelical church somewhere in Florida. And he's literally saying here in this video, it's a video too, a selfie video. He's literally saying, talking about the lessons he learned at Charis Bible College. And literally saying, I know because I'm saying this, I'm probably going to not lose my job as a youth pastor next month. I haven't even started yet. And of course, he was promptly, well, maybe not, of course, but he was promptly fired. Never got the job as a youth pastor. But later on came out and said, I did the Lord's work on that day, as I was taught at the David Barton School of Politics at Charis Bible. So, I mean, this is not just obscure stuff anymore. This is not, when I was coming up as an academic and a scholar, this was fringe stuff. These were the crazies out there, But a lot of this stuff has now, my phone rings off the hook with reporters now because people are starting to wake up to this stuff. And, a reporter who knows nothing about this calls me up and says, what is this? Who is this Lance Wallnau that was on 60 Minutes? I just had 5 calls this last week. People wanting to know more about Lance Wallnau, right? This stuff is now, I think Trump has empowered these people to have a voice and made a part of the mainstream. Charlie Kirk, can you ring a bell? I mentioned him last night. Runs an organization. You guys got to get out of this. You guys got to get out of this progressive theology bubble. I'm sorry. You got to sort of know your enemy, so to speak, right? Just hopefully you're taking that in the right spirit. Right? Charlie Kirk is an advisor to Donald Trump. He runs an organization called Turning Point USA, which is basically spreads Trumpism on college campuses. He goes on college campuses and debates people, but he also appears every Sunday at one of these mega churches, these evangelical mega churches, to get people to get onto the Trump bandwagon. I mentioned Doug Mastriano, who ran for governor of Pennsylvania. The guy to his left is a man named Sean Foy. He's an evangelical worship leader. He literally led worship at Mastriano's, when he was nominated to be the Republican nominee. They had a worship session at the political rally celebrating his, you're Pennsylvanian, right? Mastriano, celebrating his nomination as the GOP nominee. Here's a piece I wrote for the magazine I had at Current. A savior will rise from Gettysburg, and his name shall be Mastriano. He was going around essentially saying that, like, God, founded Pennsylvania and William Penn, and then God founded, saved the Union at Gettysburg, and now God's working through my campaign for the next great movement in American history. So, this guy is a real character. Anyway, and here, well, imagine this. Here's Lance Wall now, Adam Mastriano. He's one of the main speakers. So you see how this is all of this is woven together, right? He was selling coins the week before. Now he's on the stage with Doug Mastriano, trying to get him elected for governor. And of course, the MAGA Pennsylvania crowd. It's not clear whether they're raising their hand in response to a question or whether he's leading them in some type of worship, evangelical worship moment, right? Probably both. All right, some concluding thoughts. Let's wrap it up. Again, this is just review. So what I'm going to argue today, Christian nationalism confuses the United States or nationalism with what Christians believe to be the kingdom of God, right? What Jesus preached as the kingdom of God. 2, there is a difference between Christian nationalism and civil religion. I made that point. 3, Christian nationalism rejects American pluralism. They are not interested in having a diverse country. They're not interested in whether it be ideologically, politically, religiously, ethnically, racially. They're not interested in that and pluralism. They're not interested in how to live together with our most profound differences. They're not interested in the fact that democracies and republics only survive when people learn how to live in neighborhoods and communities and states and nations with people who differ from them. They are not interested in that kind of conversation. They are interested in privileging one view over another and making everybody else, to tolerate everybody else, but not accept them into a full-blown kind of pluralism. And then 4, Christian nationalism, as I've tried to now already suggest, is based on some really, really bad history. Thank you.
We're going to move into our question and answer time. So those of you on Zoom, use the Q&A section in the Zoom room, and we'll relay those questions and then open it up to questions for anybody in the room.
What is the history of the term "in God we trust"?
The history of the term "in God we trust."
Yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the term "in God we trust." It doesn't come from the founding, right? Yeah, it comes much later. It actually begins to appear on coins after the Civil War. Actually, during the Civil War, I think "in God we trust" is on a penny in 1863. It first gets on there, and "in God we trust" is a perfect example of civil religion, right? It's hard to argue, and this is where David Barton and others will make kind of points that are kind of accurate, right? It's hard to argue that there has been an acknowledgement of God. Again, we can debate what people meant when they used the phrase God. Was it the deist God of Jefferson? Was it the Christian God of Christians or whatever? But since the beginning, Justice Hugo Black in 1947 said that there's a wall of separation between church and state, and that wall should be high and impregnable, he said. But that decision showed no kind of recognition of the fact in history that there's always been times when religion and politics and government have passed through that wall, right? There's been checkpoints, right? They pray before the Senate and House meet. There's chaplains, government-funded chaplains, religious chaplains, right? So the idea of wall separation of church and state, I think, is a good principle in theory, and we should obviously support it. Fits very well with the Establishment Clause. But there's always been these kinds of examples of civil religion using the language of Judeo-Christianity, like "in God we trust," to sort of help us better understand American identity. or at least people who want us to understand. Now, the other phrase that you often get real quick is under God, right? In the Pledge of Allegiance, the original Pledge of Allegiance did not have under God. Are you aware of that, right? It was written in 1892 by a socialist named Joseph Bellamy, who did not have under, he was a Christian too, so that's not why he kept under God out. He wasn't some kind of atheist. But it was added into the Pledge of Allegiance by Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s as a means of sort of, again, this gets back to that Confederate Constitution thing, right? He didn't like that. He wanted to distinguish the United States as a Christian nation as against the atheist Soviet Union, right? So he added it into the pledge in 1950. There were some attempts to get rid of it, but they overwhelmed. In the early 2000s, there was an attempt to get rid of it, and the Supreme Court and everyone, about 90% of the American population, rejected removing it. Yeah.
None of those state laws that you mentioned the first, none of those that say you have to take the oath to vote.
Yeah, I'm glad you got back to this. I didn't want to spend too much time on it during the lecture. So eventually all those went away, right? And they went away in after the Civil War. The passing of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, basically, to paraphrase it, it basically said that all states, because the North won, right, and passed the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says essentially all states now have to conform to the United States Constitution. It was meant for slavery. In other words, now that the 13th Amendment got passed right before the 14th, which abolished slavery after the Civil War. So now slavery is illegal. Then they passed the 14th Amendment, which says anyone who had slaves, they no longer have a constitutional argument anymore, because now all the 14th Amendment says all the states have to conform to the United States Constitution. It was not until the 1940s that 14th Amendment was applied to religion. In other words, by 1940, all of these states, because of whatever we want to call it, progress or diversity, right? They had all removed that. But it wasn't until 1940 that it was legal, that it was illegal now to have a test oath or a established church in a state. So that's the story behind that. Now again, all of them had eventually removed them by the 1840s, 1850s. They had all been removed. Largely because of, forces in state legislatures that said, we're starting to become a more diverse population and we can't make people do this anymore, right? So you often hear Christian nationalists appealing to the state constitutions to justify that we were founded as a Christian nation. Now, I would say they might have a legitimate argument there if you were talking about was America founded as a Christian nation. It depends how you define nation, right? Because it was an assembly of states, and many of these states had establishments and testaments, right? But it certainly does not work then after 1866, 67, and then 1940s, 1947 actually, to suggest that America is a Christian nation. Right, so that's done. That argument is now off the books. There's no, after 1947, there's no even historical argument that one can make, if you believe in change over time, that America should be a Christian nation today, like Robert Jeffress says in his sermon. Does that make sense? So it's a little complicated, but as a historian, the sort of founding question, and I tried to lay it out in a complex way in the first lecture here. If you want to find some stuff, you can find it if you're a Christian nation defender, but not after the Civil War. You can no longer say we are a Christian nation. Now, of course, the whole argument of the Christian nationalist movement is to say that all those decisions, the Supreme Court, the 14th Amendment, right, they were all wrongly decided. Right, and that's why we need to control the Supreme Court so we can overturn all of that. Right, but right now it's law. And that's what I mean by the refusal to accept anything related to change over time. right? They want to go back to the founding as if the 13th, well, you could maybe even the 13th, but the 14th Amendment is not relevant to that, right? That didn't happen because if you're just jumping over all that history going back to the founding, you can cherry pick what you need. But if you think about the way in which legal precedent has progressed and changed over time, there's no way you can make an argument today that America is somehow officially a Christian nation, or should be, based upon what's on the books. But we're a democracy, and the books can change. And that's why, people need to be active, or as the founder said, politically jealous was their word. In other words, constantly on the lookout, constantly on guard for defending rights, liberties, and so forth that some may be trying to take away.
I have a suggestion
Yeah,
that you add number 5.
okay.
Christian nationalism is based on very bad biblical scholarship in Christian theology.
Yeah.
You're a historian, you don't have that, so you can just put it.
Add that on there too. I can totally agree with that, yeah.
You can put in parentheses that there's a vigilante progressive group in Anderson, South Carolina.
I'll add it. I'll put a footnote too for you, Steve. I'll put, thank you to the Anderson for my thoughts on point 5. That's good. No, I have people in the religion department at the school where I teach who are constantly reminding me of that as well, right? Again, I come at this as a historian, but you're right. Yeah. I don't claim to speak with authority though on theological matters. So that's why I'm right.
So when you read these other books that you mentioned,
Oh, by the way, before you go, you just mentioned other books. I'm happy to send. Somewhat, self-promoting. I put 2 of my books on there, but these are really good books to understand Christian nationalism. Maybe even good books if you can get them. Some of these people to come and speak if you're interested more on these topics. I'm happy to send you the whole PowerPoint if you want. If Steve, you can get my email from Steve, and I'll send you, all of the lectures on the PowerPoints if you want, so you don't have to copy all of this down. But I really like Whitehead and Carey, look in the middle. They're sociologists. They're not particularly interested in the historical like I am, but they're sociologists talking about it. Paul Miller is really interesting because he is a conservative evangelical who really has written a phenomenal book critiquing Christian nationalism. And there's an example, like not all conservative evangelicals are Christian nationalists. It's probably one of the best critiques of Christian nationalism I read. Again, and he is, he's speaking to his own tribe, basically, and saying, we got to get our act together. This is not good theology. This is not good, history, whatever. Yeah. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Yeah.
I was just, when you read some of these that use this jumping over history and making up stuff, do you just shake your head when you get to that stuff?
Yeah, but you run out of things to say, and I've been accused by certain kind of scholars, certain kind of historians who say, don't waste your time with that stuff. Like, why do you keep challenging this stuff? Like, it's easy to debunk. Like, it's so easy to shoot. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, like to critique David Barton. And then I go to pick up my local newspaper and look at the Saturday, religion section. It talks about all the speakers coming into town that day, and there's David Barton. And I didn't go because I was out of town that day, but I heard the place was packed. So many academics sit up in the ivory tower, and there's so many pressing issues at the ground that they don't want to address because they either think it's below them or they don't have the time. But this allows them bad history to be propagated if it's not challenged by good history. The same thing would be true for theology, right? You have to kind of challenge this stuff. And that's what I've tried to do. But yeah, there's a different claim every week that these people are making. They have radio shows, they have talk shows. Some of the stuff that comes out of their mouth is just like there's historic. I've now surveyed like tons of historians at the most conservative, at Bob Jones. The entire faculty of Bob Jones rejects David Barton. Yeah, they say it's bad history. But yet there are millions of people when they're all trained, they're smart enough to know whatever their fundamentalist beliefs are. They all have PhDs from secular universities. They know how to do good history, right? And they're not advancing this kind of Christian nationalism. They're saying all this stuff is bunk, right? Now, again, they say, we believe all these things that we believe because we believe that's what the Bible teaches. Who cares if American history is this, we don't need American history to advance our positions, right? We just have the Bible. So, so yeah, I mean, I'm beyond the point of frustrating, but and the other thing is I'm just a lone guy standing here in Anderson, South Carolina, speaking to a group of dedicated people, are interested in this stuff. And he's got the Koch brothers and all of these massive right-wing organizations just feeding wall builders his organization money. And it's like you're Don Quixote, you're just tilting at windows constantly. But you just my view of it is you just I've telling this to Steve at the break. You're kind of called to do something. You have a vocation to do something. And you just try to do it the best you can, and let the results. I'm not trying to change the world. I'm just trying to be faithful to what I think I'm supposed to do in the world, and then whatever happens, happens. But I would like to have some partners with me. There are a lot. I shouldn't say it. There are a lot of good historians out there who would care about this and are challenging this kind of stuff.
Didn't even the Southern Baptist Convention at their most recent meeting say
rejecting Christian nationalism? Yeah.
Is that a hopeful sign, maybe?
Well, I think there's still a lot of Christian nationalism. I don't know I'd be curious to know what the vote was on that.
Yeah.
I'm guessing it was probably close.
And what their motivation was.
Yeah. But there's a significant group in the Southern Baptist Convention who would reject David Barton. All the major Southern Baptist seminaries reject this kind of Barton stuff. Everything from Al Mohler's Southern Seminary to some of these other ones, Southwestern. They all would say this is a bunch of it's bunk. But I was actually talking to I'm on tape now. This is going to go on YouTube, so I shouldn't gossip. But I'll just put it this way: I've talked to professors at some of the most conservative Southern Baptist seminaries, Southern Seminary in Louisville, who will tell me that the leadership of that seminary knows that David Barton's wrong, but if they come out strongly against him, it would hurt their constituents. They would lose constituents. They would get into trouble, right, so to speak, if they reject it. So there's politics that play into this, right? Yeah.
One question. I want to report to you that in the second lecture, you have really shaken my progressive silo.
Oh, good.
Scared the hooties out of me. But let me ask a question. At one point earlier today, you quoted someone who's talking about the pillow of society.
The pillar.
The pillow of society.
George Washington.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the pillow of society? And I ask that as someone who wants to be free of this religion, hobbly-gobbly stuff. But is religion a pillar, part of the pillar, or should it get out of the pillow? What would a society look like without religion? Is it doing more harm than good? Or
George Washington, again, Pillar. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding your Southern accent. Sounds like you're saying pillow. Pillar. That's probably on me, Steve. My translation, I still have the South. This Jersey guy. No. That's the question's above my pay grade. I mean, I'm not. I had to have an opinion that would be just as equal to anybody's opinion here. George Washington believed that religion was an important pillar to the the republic. You had to have a religious people in order to sustain the republic. Now, he was one founder, and this is the only way I know how to answer your question, like, without sort of being a pontificator on contemporary issues that I'm not trained to speak to. Thomas Jefferson would have argued, maybe along the lines of, this group, that good in society, right? Morals in society, a good moral society, could be drawn from a variety of different sources beyond religion, right? The conscience, the kind of moral sense he referred to it as, hard work, right? Working, disciplining oneself. This was Ben Franklin too. Ben Franklin had 13 virtues, right, that he worked on, trying to aim towards what he called moral perfection, he called it, right? And in some ways that's the Enlightenment progressive view of society, right? We're going to overcome all limits. We're going to overcome anything that's holding us back from advancing, and tell me if I'm wrong, advancing kind of true liberty, true freedom, right? Everybody will ultimately be free. There will be, the arc of history is moving towards some kind of utopian justice where there will be, everybody, the kingdom of God, whatever, everybody will be overcome. There'll be no more division, no more racism, no more, scientific progressivism, right? There'll be, all diseases will be overcome, right? All of these things. But where's I going with this? I think Jefferson would have said, that's the trajectory of where history is moving. It's not moving towards a second coming or, God's going to come in and wrap it all up and we'll be done, right? Which is a kind of traditional Christian eschatology, Christian kind of view of history. So, do I think personally that religion should still be a pillar of society? I think if religion serves, respects human dignity, and develops a society, at least in America, in which everybody can live together with their deep, profound differences, then I think if religion can help someone do that, then I would support it. Oh, back to Franklin, moral perfection, right? He tried to master these virtues, right, by disciplining himself and showing how great of a virtuous man he was. And then he writes to his friend and he says, are there any other virtues I should add to the list? And his friend's like, yeah, there's one more you probably should, humility. So I don't know, Steve. I mean, I'm not, I could just give you my opinion. I mean, I'm a person of faith. I'm a Christian. So I do think Christianity is a double-edged sword. I mean, historically, it's really kind of been the like I talked about last night. It's been a source of great hate, division, racism, whatever you want, patriarchy, right? I mean, all of this is deeply rooted in religion. As a historian, I cannot see religion and Christianity, especially, not playing a role in some of our great social reform movements as well. And I guess as a Christian, I hold out the possibility that Christianity can serve that function again in a society, a Republican, American Republic. At least that's where I find my kind of, again, totally speaking outside of my expertise, but that's where I find my sense of hope, right? I'll be honest with you, I don't find a whole lot of hope in a kind of, progressive utopia that, the purest Enlightenment thinkers find. Right? That doesn't give me a lot of hope. So whether I'm going to be fooled at the end of the day, when it's over, who knows? But right now, religion provides a hope. You might call that a crutch, like Marx did, or the opiate of the masses, or whatever. But I'm willing to kind of, I guess, lay down my cards on the historic validity of, say, the resurrection, and some of these traditional Christian positions that don't necessarily always have to move towards the Christian right or Christian nationalism or so forth. So, showed my cards completely right there. Took the historian hat off for a second, and seems like no one's throwing anything at me. Maybe I should stop there. Yeah.
I know you said you don't deal with the current situation until it's 20 years old. But, you know, the churches are dying.
Yeah.
The young people.
That's where you look.
Yeah, the young people are not doing this any longer. And I don't know, I guess I'm waiting to hear a solution.
Well, I think this.
We've identified all the problems, but what do we do?
Well, I think the question last night that was asked of me was Trump destroying, or is Christianity being destroyed? And I kind of waffled around it a little bit, then eventually punted. I think there's the equation of politics and Christianity. I think there's a generation coming. There's nuns, but I think also among younger Christians, I see this with my own daughters in some respects, who just have had enough. They're fed up with political Christianity. They don't want to even, they don't even want to think about the election. They don't even want to go to church because they're worried about, politics getting in. They just don't want to think about that anymore. They want to serve their neighbors. They want to love God. They want to, be agents of justice and reconciliation in the world because they believe that's what Jesus wanted them to do. So they're out there. I see them, some of my students as well. Messiah is a Christian institution. So we do have I said that last night, we do have a lot of Christian students who attend. But I don't know. I don't know what the future looks like. I mean, this nuns thing is a serious issue. How to turn it around? This generation, Gen Z, is looking for authenticity. They want to see authenticity. They don't want to see, a bunch of, politicians' political speech where you don't really say what you mean, or I was watching Tom Cotton this morning on CNN, just not answering any as an Arkansas senator. He wasn't answering any. Did you see it?
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm just like, this is pathetic. Like how can any, so I don't know.
But it gives you faith when you see that there's lots of interracial friendships, lots of folks where the LGBT stuff is not an issue.
Yeah.
It is just done.
Yeah, it's clearly not an issue for my kids' generation.
Yeah.
They don't even think in those terms.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't even.
And so it's actually a wonderful group that's coming up.
Yeah.
I think probably due to Sesame Street, some of these.
Hey,
Some of these shows they were raised on.
Yeah, I was raised on Sesame Street too. So
Yeah.
I've been around that.
All right, if we have no more questions, and Dr. Fea needs to get to the airport, so
Yes.
we'll just wrap that up.
9 a.m. class tomorrow.
That's right. And so just before we wrap up completely, there are some envelopes in your chairs for those who are in person, if you'd like to make a donation so that we can continue to bring great speakers to Anderson. And for those of you on Zoom, you can always donate on our website.